Seattle, Washington, the Emerald City. With a population of 750,000 within city limits and a metro population of 4 million, it is the largest city in the state of Washington and the 15th largest in the United States. Seattle is located in the Pacific Northwest region of the US and Canada, often referred to as Cascadia, a region characterized by its lush forests and imposing mountains. The city is situated on an isthmus between Puget Sound to the west and Lake Washington to the east. It's the northernmost major city in the United States, located only 100 miles or 160 kilometers south of the Canadian border. Seattle has a Mediterranean climate with warm summers and fairly mild winters. Puget Sound and Lake Washington have a moderating effect on the climate, and thus extreme heat waves are rare in the city. Seattle is also known for its sports, having a team in 3 of the 4 main sports leagues in North America. There are the Seahawks of the National Football League with 1 Super Bowl championship back in 2013, the Mariners of Major League Baseball, who on the other hand are yet to win a World Series, and the newest member of the club, the Seattle Kraken of the National Hockey League, who were established back in 2021. The Kraken haven't won a Stanley Cup as of 2024, but the city has previously had a Stanley Cup winning team with the Seattle Metropolitans in 1917. Other teams in Seattle include the Seattle Sounders FC of Major League Soccer with 2 MLS Cups, and the Seawolves of Major League Rugby with 2 MLR championships. The city used to also have an NBA team called the Supersonics, who even won the 1979 NBA championship, but were relocated to Oklahoma City in 2008. The most successful team in Seattle, however, would be the WNBA team Seattle Storm, with a total of 4 WNBA championships. Famous Seattleites include co-founder of Microsoft and the richest person in the world at one point, Bill Gates, his co-founder Paul Allen, musicians Jimi Hendrix and Kurt Cobain, former NBA player Nate Robinson, co-founder of Valve Gabe Newell, and the YouTuber Freddie Wong, just to name a few. I had the pleasure to visit this amazing city last summer, and this will be the first part of a 4-part series where we will be visiting interesting locations all around the western United States and Canada. This video will be divided into 2 main parts. First, I will talk about the history of the city, after which I want to share my experience of visiting it and exploring some of the interesting sights it has to offer. I'll include timestamps so you can listen to the sections you are most interested in. But without further ado, let's first start with some history. Prior to European arrival, the Seattle area had been settled by Native Americans of the Coast Salish group, mainly the Duwamish and Suquamish, for at least 4,000 years. These people had around 13 villages around the current city borders of Seattle, each having 1 or more longhouses that would house 1 or more extended families. The villages didn't have formal government. Leadership was mostly appointed on a case-to-case basis, for example for a war party, for construction, or for gathering food. The leader of the village was generally the highest status male from the highest status family. However, this position changed hands often. The title of chief was usually given by the United States to make it easier to communicate with the tribes. The first European to visit the Seattle area was Captain George Vancouver of the British Royal Navy in May 1792 during an expedition to chart out the Pacific Northwest. Arriving through the Salish Sea, he decided to name the sound he just discovered Puget Sound after his second lieutenant, Peter Puget. The area would be left alone by the Europeans for quite a while, however, as most of the colonies at the time were on this side of the continent. Then in 1818, the US and the UK signed a treaty that gave joint control to both countries of the area that modern-day Seattle is located in. The British called this area the Columbia District, while the Americans called it the Oregon Country. It took another 15 years before the Hudson's Bay Company founded Fort Nisqually in 1833. It was a farm and a fur trading post, but more importantly, it was the first European settlement in the Puget Sound area. Over time, the area attracted more and more fur traders looking to capitalize on the area's beaver population, but more importantly, for a little story here, after the US and the UK agreed to divide the area along the 49th parallel, the Puget Sound area started to specifically catch the attention of American pioneers. The first non-native settlement within the modern borders of Seattle was founded in September 1851, when a party of American pioneers led by Luther Collins claimed land at the mouth of the Duwamish River and built a farm there. They weren't the only Americans interested in the area, however, as on their way to the land claim, they ran into other Americans scouting for a suitable place to start a town. The 3 men were from the Denny Party, led by Arthur Denny. The party had come to Oregon country from Illinois on the Oregon Trail earlier in the same year, but by the time the party made its way to Oregon, Arthur had fallen ill and had to stay behind in Portland with the rest of the party, while the 3 men came north to Puget Sound to scout for a good town site. They had heard of a good location at the most southwestern point of Elliott Bay called Alki Point. The 3 men arrived at the location in late September 1851 and chose it as the location for the town. They then started to build a cabin on the site with the help of the local Duwamish and staked claims on the land, naming it New York. Now, if you think this is uncreative, you're actually dead wrong, because this city is called New York City, while this place is just called New York. One of the men then returned to Portland to inform Arthur and the rest of the party of the location. Another man went to look for tools to help with building the cabin, and one man, David Denny, who was also Arthur's brother, stayed at the site to build the cabin. He hurt his leg in the process though, so by the time the others arrived at the site, the roof was still unfinished. Hearing the news, the rest of the Denny party then set sail on an 8-day trip from Portland, Oregon. It was a grueling journey, especially for Arthur, who was still sick. The founding date of the city of Seattle is nowadays considered to be November 13th, 1851, the day when the Denny party arrived at Alki Point, with David greeting them with the words, "I wish you hadn't come." So the founding words of Seattle were essentially, "You made a big mistake." Regardless, the party had to start working on the roof to finish the cabin since winter was just around the corner. Arthur, on the other hand, soon realized that Alki Point was actually a terrible location for the town, as the beach was too shallow for a harbor, and the site was wide open to the main part of Puget Sound, which could get quite volatile during storms. So when the worst of the winter had passed, Arthur and company began scouting for a new town site. They found a location on the eastern shore of Elliott Bay, which had a natural deep water harbor and was protected by the bay. So in April 1852, most of the Denny party abandoned the Alki site and relocated to the new site in the modern-day area of Pioneer Square in downtown Seattle. There, they gave the new settlement the now iconic name, Duwamish. They named the town in honor of the Duwamish people. However, I can imagine it was pretty difficult for people to pronounce. So only a year later, one of the founders of Duwamish, Doc Maynard, managed to convince the settlers to change the settlement's name to Seattle, after his friend and chief of the Suquamish and Duwamish tribes, Chief Seattle, or
Seattle.
Seattle was born to two prestigious Duwamish and Suquamish families sometime in the early 1780s, and thus grew up speaking both the Duwamish and Suquamish dialects of the southern Lushootseed language. As a child, he witnessed George Vancouver's expedition into Puget Sound as the captain stopped to trade goods with the natives. Seattle would also travel to Fort Nisqually to trade with the Hudson's Bay Company, making him well acquainted with Europeans and their culture. As Seattle aged, he gained a reputation as an excellent warrior among the two tribes, participating in several wars against other tribes, leading many successful raids and ambushes himself. The final war he fought was against the Chemakum tribe in 1847, and although the Suquamish-Clallam coalition won the war, pretty much wiping out the Chemakum, Seattle's eldest son died in the last battle, leading Seattle to retire from fighting and convert to Catholicism at around the age of 65. From here, he started to seek cooperation with the increasing numbers of ethnic Europeans in the area. See, since his first encounters with Europeans, Seattle probably had become fascinated with Europeans and their culture. He sought contact with businessmen and community leaders, and helped pioneers with accommodation and guidance along the Duwamish River. Thanks to his prominent position within the Duwamish and Suquamish tribes, he became known to many pioneers as Chief Seattle. One such pioneer was Doc Maynard, who heard of the new settlement at Alki Point and decided to pack his stuff and move there. And like many others, he got on a canoe owned by Seattle who would take him there. The two became very good friends and formed a bond that would last a lifetime. After the formation of the Washington Territory in 1853, the Duwamish leaders started to form the first plats of the town. It was Maynard who managed to convince the other town leaders to file the plats under the name of Seattle, in honor of the white-friendly native leader and his friend. And the name Seattle first appeared on official Washington Territory papers on May 23, 1853. When Arthur Denny and company left Alki Point in 1852, Charles Terry and some of the pioneers decided to stay at the old settlement and try to make it work. For a few years, there was a rivalry between Seattle and New York Alki, as they were now called, although it wasn't much of a rivalry, as it only took 2 years for Seattle to completely stomp NYA, leading the residents to abandon the site and join the rest of the party in Seattle. Now, the history of Seattle from this point can be divided into 5 separate boom and bust cycles, where the city first experiences an economic boom in a certain industry, followed by a period of recession or a bust. And the very first boom the city experienced was the timber industry boom. Timber became the first main industry of the city, as there was no shortage of quality timber around the area. Henry Yesler, an entrepreneur from Ohio, arrived in Duwamish in 1852 and built the first steam-powered sawmill in the village. The sawmill then enabled the settlement to go into the timber industry and provide the settlers and the local Duwamish with numerous jobs. Seattle began growing in prominence thanks to the timber industry boom, shipping logs down to San Francisco. By 1855, 3 years after its founding, the town had reached a population of 300. Or about the same as Kismanyuk in Hungary. The early Seattleites didn't get to enjoy the good times for too long, however, as the frustration of many Native American tribes caused by the unfavorable treaties pushed upon them by the territorial governor escalated into the Yakima War in the Pacific Northwest in 1855. The US Navy's USS Decatur arrived in Seattle to provide defense and help build fortifications in preparation for an attack. The hostilities eased up during the winter, but words of new attacks reached Seattle in early 1856. So the governor arrived in Seattle to discount down the rumors to the worried settlers on January 21st. But as soon as he sailed away from Seattle, the settlers received new word that the rumors were in fact true, and a Native American war party was headed towards the village. It's believed that Sial and other Duwamish might have been the ones to warn the settlers of the incoming attack. In response, the Marines on the USS Decatur started to prepare the village for a battle. Doc Maynard, who had become a local Indian agent, is reputed to have evacuated 434 friendly Native Americans to the other side of the Sound, which he financed at his own expense. The Battle of Seattle began on January 26, 1856, when the USS Decatur spotted and started firing its cannons at the tree line, where the tribal forces were preparing for an attack. The two belligerents exchanged fire until 11:45 a.m., when the native forces apparently stopped for a lunch break. The defenders took this as an opportunity to evacuate the women and the children to the ship, but when other settlers tried to retrieve guns and other valuables from their abandoned houses, the natives opened fire again. From there, the firefight continued for several hours. At one point, when the natives started preparing to set the settlers' houses on fire, the Decatur started firing at the houses, damaging several homes. The firefight ended again at 10 p.m. when it got too dark to see. By the next morning, the attackers had looted everything they could and left. In the end, the battle lasted about a day. 2 settlers died in the battle, while the amount of casualties on the native side is unknown, as no bodies were ever found in the area. Following the battle, the town started the construction of a wooden defensive wall around the settlement. However, after the defeat, the tribal coalition never tried another attack on the town. The skirmish, later named the Battle of Seattle, remains the first and the last battle the city would ever see. Seattle returned to the regularly scheduled lumberjacking in mid-1856, and the town continued to grow. By 1857, Arthur Denny was the second richest person in Seattle after Henry Yesler. He had been serving in the Washington Territorial Legislature for a few years at this point, and in 1857, he became the Speaker of the House of Representatives. At the time, the legislature had 3 important decisions to make: where to put the territory's capital, where to put the territorial penitentiary, and where to put the territorial university. Denny started pushing to make Seattle the capital, which was then temporarily located in Olympia. He was unsuccessful at this, however, and began to pursue the university instead. This time he found success, and in 1858, Seattle was chosen as the site for the new university, with the University of the Territory of Washington beginning operations in 1861. The university was designed and built by a man named John Pike, and after the completion of the university, Denny named Pike Street in his honor, which in turn gave its name to Pike Place. The university didn't initially bring too many people to town, so Seattle kept growing mainly thanks to its timber industry. By 1865, the village had grown enough that it was incorporated as a town. Unfortunately for the local Native Americans, however, one of the first things the town government did was to enact an ordinance prohibiting Native Americans from living within the town boundaries unless they lived right next to their employer. Among other things, this meant that Sial, who the place was named after, wasn't allowed to live in Seattle anymore. He moved to the Port Madison Reservation on the other side of the Sound. He would visit his white friends and the Native Americans of Seattle a few times before his death from a brief illness the next year. He was buried at the Port Madison Reservation, the reservation created for his Suquamish people. Back in Seattle, the town government was made up of an elected board of trustees, which included, for example, Henry Yesler, David Denny, and Charles Terry, who served as the president. However, after only 2 years, the town was disincorporated when the leading citizens of Seattle filed a petition for the dissolution of the town, possibly because of the taxes the board of trustees had enacted, and so Seattle once again became a precinct of King County for about 2 years, because in 1869, the citizens asked the territory to incorporate the town again, this time as a city with a mayor and a city council instead of a board of trustees. By 1870, the city had reached a population of 1,100, or about the same as Boddington, Western Australia. Everything seemed to be going well for Seattle until 1873, when the Northern Pacific Railway chose Seattle's rival town, Tacoma, as their western terminal for the Transcontinental Railway. Back in those days, a railroad connection could make or break a town, so a railroad connecting Tacoma to the rest of the country could easily make the town pass Seattle in importance. But refusing to be bested by Tacoma, Seattle decided on building their own railroad, called the Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad. It was supposed to connect Seattle to the territory's largest city at the time, Walla Walla in southeastern Washington. A delegation of prominent city leaders like Arthur Denny and Henry Yesler went down to Walla Walla to introduce their idea to the city council, which wasn't interested in the project at all. They already had a connection to Portland through the Columbia River. So, like the expert negotiators they were, Seattle decided to just build the railroad by themselves. However, it turns out you can't just build a railroad out of sheer spite. So the Seattle and Walla Walla project never actually went farther than Newcastle. But even without being connected to the other half of its name, the Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad did manage to turn in a profit thanks to the rich coal fields of Renton and Newcastle. And so Seattle kept growing and reached a population of 3,500 retired by 1880, or about the same as El Camino Real Charter High School in Woodland Hills, California. In 1883, the telephone came to Seattle, and a year later, the city got its first streetcar. Union organizing also began in the 1880s, with the printers organizing a union in 1882, followed by the dock workers in 1886, the cigar makers in 1887, and the tailors in 1889, followed by many other, mostly skilled crafts unions. But despite all the advancements, the city was a relatively lawless place. The schools barely operated, and most of the city lived without indoor plumbing. The city also suffered from anti-Chinese vigilantism. Chinese labor was crucial in many of the city's projects, such as the first attempt at the Montlake Cut, connecting Lake Union to Lake Washington. However, many of the white laborers, sometimes with Native Americans, angry at the cheap labor competition, culminated in riots in 1885 and 1886, and the expulsion of Chinese immigrants in many cities around the Puget Sound area, with most Chinese immigrants deciding to return back to China. This was also during the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned all immigration of Chinese laborers to the United States. The end of the 1880s in Seattle wasn't any better either, as the city was hit by the Great Seattle Fire of 1889, when a glue pot was accidentally overturned in a carpentry shop. The fire destroyed nearly all of the central business district. However, the city was rebuilt exceedingly quickly, with a new, far more grandiose business district. The reconstruction also brought many new jobs to the city, which grew the population from 25,000 to 40,000 within a single year. Seattle was then hit hard again, this time with the Panic of 1893 and the following 4-year-long economic depression in the United States. A more positive development was finally being connected to the rest of the country by rail, with the Great Northern Railway in 1893. See, the railroad being connected to Tacoma over Seattle was sort of a double-edged sword. Both Tacoma and Seattle began as lumber towns. However, when Tacoma was chosen as the railroad terminus, Seattle had to diversify its industries, while Tacoma focused more heavily on the timber industry. By 1893, Seattle was the biggest city and the most major industrial hub in the state. Essentially, the city had become too important for the railroad not to come. Thanks to this railway connection, coupled with the fact that Seattle was a deep water port, the city started to become one of the most prominent port cities on the West Coast, being able to compete with cities like Portland and San Francisco. What took Seattle out of the economic recession, though, was when gold was discovered in the Klondike region of Canada in 1896. The Klondike gold rush that followed was the city's second major economic boom, after the timber industry boom of the city's early years. Seattle acted as a supply hub and a jumping-off point for prospectors on their way to Klondike during the rush. The economic boom was the largest Seattle had ever seen proportional to the city's size, and by 1900, Seattle had doubled in population to 80,000, putting it on par with prominent eastern cities like Nashville and Richmond. The century ended with the death of Arthur Denny in January 1899. The leader of the Denny Party had seen the city grow from a small village with a lumber mill to one of the biggest cities in the US. His brother, David, would die only 4 years after him in 1903. Today, virtually everything in the city that's named Denny is named after them. In the early 1900s, Seattle made huge efforts to reshape the topography of the city. Hills to the north and south of the city were leveled, and the dirt was used to make the waterfront look less like this and more like this. The Montlake Cut was also finally finished, along with the Fremont Cut, connecting Lake Washington to Puget Sound. At the same time, city planners began putting numerous parks and boulevards into the city. Seattle also expanded in land area, annexing Columbia City, Ballard, South Park, and West Seattle in 1907. Meanwhile, Georgetown, where Luther Collins had built his farm before the founding of Seattle, was annexed in 1910. The economic boom also allowed for the establishment of new companies such as Nordstrom, the Pacific Aero Products Company, now known as Boeing, and the American Messenger Company, now known as UPS. Another point of pride for the city was the completion of the Smith Tower in 1914. At the time of the completion, the Smith Tower was the tallest building west of the Mississippi River, a title it would retain for decades. In sports, the city celebrated the city's hockey team, the Seattle Metropolitans, winning the Stanley Cup in March 1917. The celebration was short-lived though, as only 9 days later, the United States entered the Great War that was raging on in Europe. For Seattle, the war brought the city's third major economic boom, as the US government had a sudden need for warships. In just 4 years, the number of shipyards in Seattle increased from 1 in 1914 to 12 in 1918. However, this was once again a double-edged sword, as this wartime boom caused Seattle to solely focus on the shipbuilding and lumber industries. So when the war ended in 1918, Seattle's economy hit a wall and fell off a cliff. This, of course, caused a lot of tensions in the labor market, culminating in a massive labor strike in 1919. On top of that, the end of World War I also marked the arrival of the 1918 influenza pandemic, and the deadly virus got the city officials so worried, in fact, that to prevent the spread of disease, the city government ordered schools, private businesses, and public places to close down, and mandated the citizens to wear a mask in public places. Does this sound familiar yet? Heading into the 1920s, however, the worst of the pandemic was over and Seattle began to slowly get back on its feet. In 1920, Seattle was the 20th largest city in the United States with a population of over 300,000. Seattle also became the first major American city to elect a female mayor with the election of Bertha Knight Lance in 1926. The city continued to be moderately prosperous in the 1920s, but then in 1929, the American stock market crashed, which led to the decade-long Great Depression. Seattle was hit particularly hard by the Depression, and in 1934, due to the violence of a maritime strike in Seattle, the city lost much of its maritime and Asian trade to Los Angeles. Seattle also housed one of the most famous Hoovervilles during the Great Depression. The shantytown had its own government, its own mayor, and even collected extensive documentation. They even recorded a population of 639. Only 7 of whom were women. Then, in 1941, the US entered the Second World War. And much like in World War, the original, the US government was in dire need of Seattle's industrial services, this time with the construction of tens of thousands of new aircraft. To meet their needs, the government turned to the Seattle-based aircraft manufacturer Boeing, and the company quickly became the largest employer in the city, boosting the economy out of the Great Depression and kickstarting the city's 4th major economic boom. Civilian use of the city's then main airport, the Boeing field was greatly reduced to accommodate the manufacturing of warplanes, prompting the city to work with Tacoma to establish the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The war also revived the shipbuilding industry in Seattle and the Puget Sound region, as tens of thousands of men and women worked at the shipyards to build warships for the Navy. The booming wartime economy was attractive to many Southern African Americans who moved to the north and west during the second wave of the Great Migration. Seattle's black population grew from around 3,000 in 1940 to 15,000 in 1950, being employed in a variety of professions including in shipbuilding, aircraft manufacturing, military, and as non-military government employees. On the downside, racial tensions and segregation continued to be widespread for a long time. The treatment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War should also not be forgotten, as 7,000 Japanese immigrants and ethnic Japanese citizens were relocated to internment camps, emptying the second largest Japantown in the nation. In 1945, the US and the Allies won again, and as a result, the military cancelled its war contracts with Seattle again, causing a stark dip in the city's economy. Again, this time Seattle was better prepared, however, as Boeing rose to become one of the leaders in the commercial airliner market. So this time, Seattle actually managed to keep the economic momentum going even after the war. Seattle celebrated its restored prosperity with the World's Fair in 1962, with nearly 10 million visitors during this 6-month period. One of the buildings built for the fair was the Space Needle in 1961, which at the time was the tallest structure west of the Mississippi River. Seattle suffered yet another recession in the late 1960s and early 1970s due to the oil crises, of government contracts, and costs and delays connected to the Boeing 747. Despite this, one of the city's most famous companies, Starbucks, was founded during this time. The Seattle Supersonics were also established in 1967 to join the NBA, with the team winning their first and only NBA championship in 1979. Other sports teams established during this time include the Seattle Seahawks in 1976 and the Seattle Mariners in 1977. The Supersonics would remain the only Seattle-based major league team to win a championship, however, for the rest of the 20th century. Prosperity returned in the 1980s, with Microsoft's relocation from Albuquerque, New Mexico, to Seattle's neighboring city, Bellevue, in 1979. Seattle and its suburbs became a hub for technology companies such as Amazon and T-Mobile, bringing technological talent from all over the world to the city. This began the city's 5th and most recent economic boom, and by 1990, Seattle's metro population was over 2.2 million. Seattle began gaining national and international attention with movies such as Sleepless in Seattle and TV series like Frasier, as well as grunge that was born in the Seattle music scene, with the most famous grunge band being Nirvana. In sports, the city got its 4th major league sports team in the Seattle Sounders in 2007. However, a year later, the Supersonics relocated to Oklahoma City, bringing the number back down to 3. In 2013, the city celebrated its first Super Bowl when the Seahawks beat the Broncos at Super Bowl 48. In 2021, Seattle finally got back to 4 major league teams, with the Seattle Kraken joining the NHL as an expansion team. Today, Seattle is the 10th largest metropolitan economy in the United States, above Boston and below Philadelphia. The city is one of the most educated cities in the country, with 68% of citizens 25 and above having completed at least a bachelor's degree. One of the challenges the city is facing currently, however, is the homeless population, which, according to some sources, is the 3rd largest in the country after Los Angeles and New York. The story of Seattle is a great example of the pioneering tradition of the United States, being founded on the faraway western edge of the continent by a group of individuals looking for a new place to call home. and a bit of profit. Not a king or the government of the country, ordinary people. And although the settlement had its own difficulties in the beginning, it grew into a major hub for the lumber industry and later for the transcontinental railway that connected the country. And today, it's one of the biggest cities in the US. Not bad if you ask me. But now that we know the history of the city, let's explore it. I started my journey in the Fremont neighborhood of northern Seattle. It was originally its own city, but was later annexed by Seattle during the economic boom of the reconstruction of the city following the Great Fire. The neighborhood is a very peaceful and typical American suburb with single-family homes, and thanks to its elevation, you can get a great view of downtown Seattle from many parts of Fremont. And on a good day, you can even see Mount Rainier in the backdrop. Fremont was known for its artistry in the 1990s. Some of the most famous artworks include the Fremont Troll, a 5.5 meter tall statue under the Aurora Bridge that depicts a troll crushing a real Volkswagen Beetle, and like you would expect from an American city, yeah, Fremont was also known for its counterculture in the 90s. The statue was salvaged from a scrapyard in Slovakia after the fall of the Soviet Union by an art-loving Seattleite and has been in public display in Fremont since 1995. Moving down to the shore of Lake Union, I caught this great view of the Seattle skyline. There's also many opportunities to go rowing or boating from Lake Union to Lake Washington or Puget Sound if you wish. From there, I decided to take a bus to downtown Seattle. Arriving at the intersection of 3rd Avenue and Spring Street, I was met with skyscrapers towering above everywhere around me. The downtown is relatively compact compared to other big cities in the US, but the streets didn't feel too crowded or the traffic too bad, at least during this Saturday morning in August. The city's most interesting sights though were at the harbor, so I made my way down to the central waterfront, which is one of the most popular tourist spots in the city, and it shows, as the amount of foot traffic was night and day compared to the downtown just one block over. Here you can find restaurants, gift shops, boat tours to Puget Sound, or you can take a ride on the Seattle Great Wheel, or you can just admire the scenery and listen to some music. From there, I went to visit the Pike Place Market, one of the most famous landmarks in Seattle. Opened in 1907, it is one of the oldest farmers markets still in operation in the US. Here, you can also visit the first Starbucks in the world. That's if you want to wait in line for 3 hours for some overpriced lattes. Next, I wanted to go see the Space Needle, probably the most famous landmark of the city. On my way, I walked through the Belltown neighborhood of Seattle, known for its trendy restaurants, boutiques, and nightclubs, and its walkable streets. It was named the best place to retire in the Seattle metro area by CNN back in 2007. Here you can even visit a Starbucks without having to wait in line for half your life. After Belltown, I arrived at the Space Needle. Standing at 184 meters, it was once the tallest structure west of the Mississippi River, and was built to withstand winds up to 320 kilometers per hour and earthquakes up to 9.0 in magnitude. The tower is surrounded by a park that holds restaurants, concerts, fountains, artwork, and museums. Yes, this is a museum. At this point, I decided to go check out a lookout point on the southern slope of Queen Anne Hill, where supposedly you could get a good view of the city. I walked up the hill to Kerry Park, which became one of my favorite spots in the city. The view was exactly as advertised. The Space Needle with the city skyline on the background was definitely worth the walk up the hill. On a good day, you can even see Mount Rainier in the background. But after walking around the city the whole day, I wanted to take a bus back to downtown Seattle, and I did. After the bus was 40 minutes late. And as a European, I can confirm this is actually the worst thing that's ever happened to me. Finally, I went to check out the Chinatown International District. It is a multi-ethnic neighborhood consisting mainly of people of Chinese, Japanese, and Vietnamese descent. The neighborhood is full of restaurants offering food from a variety of Asian countries. The street signs are both in English and Chinese, and the Chinese artwork and cultural tradition is evident everywhere around you. For the sports fans out there, you can get a great view of Lumen Field and T-Mobile Park from here as well. Overall, the city is filled with things to see, and Mount Rainier and the Puget Sound give the city a feeling of nature as well. But having spent a few days in the city, I packed my belongings and headed to the Flixbus terminal in Chinatown, which was just a random parking lot, but Flixbus terminal sounds cooler. There, I got on a long-distance bus and started heading north to my next destination. But that's gonna wrap up our tour of the history and city of Seattle. Hope you enjoyed it. This is the first part of a 4-part series across the western United States and Canada. Next week, we're gonna cross the border to Canada. However, if you're interested in seeing that episode already, it's available right now on my Patreon. My patrons, regardless of membership fee, will get every episode of this series and all future series a week early on Patreon. Additionally, my Patreon producers will have their names shown on the screen at the end of videos. If this interests you, there's a link in the description. See you in Canada.